Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to 7 ways British and American restaurants are very different. Now, this is a video from Lost in the Pond, rapidly becoming one of my favorite YouTube channels. And I would not think, I've dined in a few American restaurants, mostly in Florida, and I've not noticed much different. Maybe the free refills, but perhaps the restaurants, they know they're catering to mainly tourists, so they adopt more of a European or international type of commerce. So I'm not sure if I was getting the genuine bona fide American restaurant experience. So yeah, this video here should shed a bit more light on the differences, and yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So let's do it.
And I'm sure to some degree there'll be places in Britain that sell Chicago style pizza even though it's nothing like it. Or even in my birthplace of Cleethorpes, Chicago style burgers, whatever that is. Hello, I'm Lawrence, and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond. And one of those memos pertains to restaurants. And because food is involved, restaurants happen to be a kind of central hub for where British and American differences play out more broadly. Because we see differences in not just the food, but the terminology that's used and some of the customs that are practiced and the practices that are customed. And of course, the mere concept of a restaurant, I don't know why I'm doing that, the mere concept of a restaurant is universal. But the way that they are presented to and used by Brits and Americans is subtly and sometimes not so subtly different. And so here are 7 ways in which British and American restaurants are very different. For Brits moving to or even visiting the United States of America, one of the biggest culture shocks, at least for me, was the kind of round-the-clock attention that servers pay to their customers. What's that?
This has got to be for the tips, I think, right?
Your glass of water is empty, we can't be having that. American servers come right on over, minus the whistling sound, usually. And in between that and a bite of your broccoli, American waitstaff will be over just to simply ask, how's that food tasting? Can I get you anything else? Golly gee, that's a nice accent. Which part of Australia are you from? Those kind of questions. Whereas British waitstaff are staff that, wait to come over until you're all done. And part of this is tied to the notion of tips and tipping. In Britain, contrary to popular belief, servers do make a bulk of their income from tips. But unlike in America, tipping is voluntary and not at all expected. A lot of Brits who come to the United States, myself included, don't know this at first. In my case, I even asked the waiter how much I should tip, so I gave her the 75% she recommended and moved on. Of course, with time, I came to learn that the expected amount here in the United States of America is 15 to 20% of your bill and or check. Will come onto terminology later.
Is it true, guys, that your food is a bit cheaper than ours in restaurants, and that's why tipping is encouraged to keep the prices low? Is that actually true?
Often been noted, especially with...
For example, a burger, if you wanted to go to a burger place or a sit-down restaurant for a steak, here it would cost you about, for a decent steak, £20. So that's about 25 bucks, but we don't have to tip here. Is it the same over there?
Within the fast food industry, the portion sizes in the United States of America are much larger than their European counterparts. But often, depending on where you go, this can also be true of sit-down restaurants. One of the first major American sit-down chain restaurants that I visited was a little place called Applebee's. And at the likes of Applebee's, but also the Olive Garden or TGI Friday or any number of other chains, your appetizer almost feels like a main course / entree. Again, terminologies later. And by the time that the actual main course arrives, you eat it merely out of politeness, while pretending that this is all fine. And then, this is the really funny bit, they ask you if you want to see the dessert menu. And of course you can't say no, because you're addicted to cheesecake. And that's always humongous and rich, as opposed to humongous and poor, which is what you are when you leave the restaurant. Except that cheap joke doesn't quite work, because American food on the whole is actually cheaper compared to the food served in Britain, which is partially how you account for the portion size difference. Now, after a while, I noticed that there were Americans all around me that instead of ploughing through this mountain of calories in one sitting, answered yes to what was then an unfamiliar question to me. That's right. It's completely normal in the United States of America to have your food boxed at the end of the meal with the intention of you taking it home and refrigerating it, or just eat it later that night if you're feeling lucky. And of course now that makes sense, right? I mean, you've paid your money for that food, you want to get your money's worth. But on top of that, it cuts down on waste. But at first, just because of what I was used to back home, it seemed weird to be taking...
Yeah, to be honest, it's not really a done thing here. You either go in for a sit-down meal or you get a takeaway. Like, I've never been in a sit-down restaurant and then asked for it's not really a done thing here.
Left.
To be honest though, it might actually not be a bad idea.
Leftovers home from a restaurant. In Britain, as evidenced by this BBC article from a few years back, we've historically felt embarrassed even to ask for a box or a doggy bag because I don't know, I haven't a clue why actually. Either way, I think leftovers are great to the extent that I have Indian food for breakfast. Don't judge me. Buffets. Aside from the fact that America seems to be just a tad more into them than Britain, there's an aspect of the buffet-going experience that differs greatly between the two countries. Where I was from, depending on the buffet in question, I almost got the impression that it was rude to the kitchen staff to ask for a new plate when you're going up for seconds. In other words, whenever I went for, say, a Chinese buffet, I would go up, get my plate, scoop on all the food, go back to my table, realise that I am unrelentingly gluttonous, and then go back up for seconds using the same plate. It made me feel good that while devouring lots of solids, I'd done a solid to the kitchen staff. That could be taken
because they didn't have to wash the extra plate.
Whereas once I moved to the United States, I realised that this was considered either weird or unhygienic. At American buffets, customers are expected to get a new, cleaner plate when they go up for seconds, because this is a measure seen at preventing cross-contamination. But I have to say, after practicing both methods, neither has caused me any personal problems. But while we're on the subject of Chinese food,
But cross-contamination, if the food is all cooked, why would there be cross-contamination?
Brings us on to this. I think it's fair to say that in both Britain and America, ethnic food, or food that is usually associated with a country that is not this one, is extremely popular. And to varying degrees, no matter if you're talking about the United States or Britain, the same countries are often represented at the dinner table. Off the top of my head, the big one is Chinese food. Except you guessed it, British Chinese food and American Chinese food is vastly different. In Britain, Chinese food is often spicy, sometimes curry-based. In the US, on the other hand, Chinese food tends to be centered around standalone fried meats, usually of the chicken variety. Now, these are not entirely absent from Britain, but one way that America differentiates itself is that its Chinese food tends to be a lot sweeter than in Britain. But whichever way you slice it, I planned that. Both British and American Chinese cuisine is a modified version of what actual Chinese people eat.
I had orange chicken for the first time in America. Oh my God, it was so good. It had this sweetness to it. What's your go-to Chinese, by the way? Mine is like a chicken chow mein, so chicken fried noodles, and a king prawn fried rice with maybe a side of sweet and sour king prawns, Cantonese style. Guys, I'm getting hungry just talking about it. I need to get some Chinese tonight.
In China. And this seems to be a common theme that actually unites Britain and America. Take, for example, Indian food. While it should be pointed out that Indian food is more widely eaten in Britain than in the United States, and that in my experience, certain Indian curries tend to be spicier than their American counterparts, neither is anywhere near as spicy as authentic Indian. On the other hand, in terms of everything I just said there, almost the exact opposite is true of Mexican food. America, by virtue of its neighbourly status with Mexico, eats way more Mexican food than Britain does. Even if, by all accounts, tacos and the like have started to make waves in Britain. But even America's version of Mexican food is often a departure from what's eaten south of the border, with authentic Mexican food often less spicy than Americans are used to. And it was in the restaurants of America that I got a first-hand feel for how America likes to modify the national dishes of other countries to create what amounts to their own version, because they even do this with English cuisine. And that brings us on to this. If you were to ask me to name 3 dishes from both countries, off the top of my head I would say this. For Britain, fish and chips, Sunday roast, and a full English breakfast. For America, hamburgers, hot dogs, and
chicken and
pizza.
waffles.
And yes, I realise that all of those have disputed or undisputed origins in Germany and Italy, but over time they have become synonymous with the United States. But to a lesser degree, and because of American influence, hamburgers, hot dogs and pizza can all be found in restaurants in the UK. And I'm sure to some degree there'll be places in Britain that sell Chicago-style pizza even though it's nothing like it. Or even
Yeah, there's loads of places that are like inspired by American cuisine. Like I was in central London like a few months back and I went to Bodine's. I think it's a Kansas City style barbecue place. It was really good, really good.
even in my birthplace of Cleethorpes, Chicago-style burgers, whatever that is. But in reverse, whenever America tries to replicate popular British dishes, it's sort of like being in an alternate universe. It's great, but it's different. Very rarely do you get fish and chips where the chips/fries are thick cut and greasy, and the fish is singular and large. Instead, you usually get 3 or 4 smaller pieces of fish that are usually a tad saltier than what you'd expect back home. Oh, and did I mention there's no mushy peas? Honestly, it's like being in the south of England. And in terms of the other two, the Sunday roast and the full English breakfast, well, I found those a lot harder to come by in the US than fish and chips. Even at those pubs that, every state has, that purport to be authentically British. And lastly, we can't talk about British versus American restaurant differences without talking about the terminology. You see, it's one thing to get your food boxed at the end of a sit-down meal, but many of us might like to take it home without sitting down in the restaurant in the first place. In Britain, I always knew this as getting takeaway, which is why I was profoundly confused when I worked in an American office environment and they talked about the key takeaways from the meeting. I thought I was getting
the keto
curry and chips. In America, this is referred to as takeout or sometimes carry out.
So fairly
regardless
similar.
of portion size, we can't even agree on what to call each meal. In the US, for the most part, the meal immediately preceding the main meal is usually known as an appetizer. In Britain, I always refer to this as a starter, but some, as the French do, might call it an entree. And this is where things get confusing, because Americans and Canadians alike use the word entree to mean the main meal. For us, the main meal is usually known as the main course. If it's a Sunday roast, that main course will include a Yorkshire pudding, and this is where things get doubly confusing, because we in Britain also use the word pudding as a catch-all term for dessert. In fairness, we do also interchangeably use the word dessert. In America, the word pudding is more specific, and the catch-all term has been deserted in favour of dessert. And the implements with which we eat this food, i.e. the knife, fork and spoon, is known collectively in the United States as silverware, whereas this word, when used in Britain, would pertain more to ornate metal plates or perhaps metallic jugs.
Yeah, we'd use the word cutlery.
Or sports trophies. A lot of the time, instead, we'll collectively refer to knives, forks and spoons as cutlery. And as we all know, it's very rude to leave a restaurant without paying. And this is why we ask for the bill, or at least we do in Britain. Because most of the time here in the US, Americans will ask for the check. And that's it for this episode. Let me know in the comments below.
I completely forgot about the cutlery and silverware one. Like, I completely forgot. And I was surprised that the tip one wasn't mentioned. It was kind of like just kind of hinted at, but it wasn't really spoken about. And that was going to be like, after I finished my intro, I was like, I forgot to mention tipping. That was going to be a big one. But yeah, for the most part, the restaurant experience is really similar. Another one that Lawrence didn't mention is the time. Like, usually I've heard that if you go in a restaurant in the US, within like an hour and a half, you're kind of expected to be done. Whereas here, it's you're pretty much going to be there for like over 2 hours, just like schmoozing and taking it slow. But yeah, both have their advantages and disadvantages. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.